our next presenters, we have Paul Black from Raleigh Transportation and Dr. Kristin Williams from publicinput.com to talk about collaborative and consistent community engagement. Paul and Kristin, I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I want to start by thanking everybody for joining us for this conversation. I am Kristin Williams, the training lead and engagement specialist at publicinput.com. And I am here with Paul Black, who is the bicycle and pedestrian program manager for the city of Raleigh here in North Carolina. Next slide, please. And then the next one. I skipped ahead for y'all a little bit. So that's us. You see us. Next slide, please. So the city of Raleigh is known for its strong commitment to community engagement. They're always working to make sure that they go above and beyond to try to reach everybody in the community and get their feedback, their input, their ideas, and then merge that with the expertise of staff, especially when it comes to addressing, bicycle and pedestrian concerns and improving bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure throughout the city. And to do this, they employ both a mixed methods approach to engagement, and they bring in as many departments as they can to really bring in that interdepartmental approach to solving these issues throughout the city. We have a quote here from John Anagnost. He is a planner in Raleigh's Planning and Development department. And I think that, this quote really sums up the challenges of engagement. We can't expect people to know the ins and outs of planning, right? And what that means is, you all know that it is so important to clearly communicate a project, its goals, its timelines, how it's going to affect the everyday person, right? We have to ensure that that message is widespread, it's getting to where it needs to get to, and that it's in words that people understand. And then we got to encourage people to participate when it's appropriate. And we need to, let them know that their feedback is appreciated and will be used throughout the process. But you also know that that is not always easy, right? And one of the projects that really highlights this is a project. Next slide, please. Next slide. One of the projects that really underscores this in Raleigh is the Capitol Boulevard North project. And anybody who is from Raleigh, anybody who knows about Raleigh, has traveled through, knows that Capitol Boulevard gets you where you need to go, but is a headache. It's a headache for drivers, it's a headache for pedestrians, it's a headache for bicyclists. And Raleigh has been trying to tackle these issues. And part of what they've done is every department, right, is working together with this mixed methods approach to engagement, using things like online surveys, text surveys, putting out YouTube updates to let people know how the process is going. This has been critical, especially during COVID, when those outreach efforts are really focused virtually. Pop-up events, that's another big one. Next slide, please. I don't know why I keep saying that. Sorry, y'all. I feel the need to sing it. But, like I said, this Capitol Boulevard North project has been one of those really big interdepartmental efforts where various engagement methods have been used. And so I want to bring you in here because I know that even though this project was not housed in your department, you were brought in for your expertise. So can you tell me about your work on this Capitol Boulevard North project?
Yeah, so the land use side of the house with John came in and said a lot of the problems in this corridor are really transportation related. And in particular, it's extremely unfriendly to bicycle and pedestrian users. What can we do? So I've got experience with MPOs. I was actually the North Carolina MPO Association president for a while. I've sort of seen things from the regional perspective and from the high traffic side. This is a connection between our inner interstate loop 440 and our outer interstate loop 540. It carries about 100,000 cars a day down in the southern end. To use some ugly terminology, it's a traffic sewer. And my boss always gives me a hard time. He says, people are not excrement. Don't call it that. But really, if you think about it, sewer infrastructure is extremely critical. Things fall apart without it. It's really needed, but it's not something people want to be near. And Capitol Boulevard really is the same way. While it still has lots of destinations, it's unfriendly regardless of what mode you're traveling. It's not great for transit, it's not great for cars, and it's really terrible for bike and ped. The initial thought from John and his team was, how do we make this a more livable, workable street? And I think they had in mind some things. I don't know that many Florida examples. I know Virginia a little better, but Arlington, Virginia, Wilson Boulevard. So I thought, yeah, that could work. And then I started doing some looking with some friends in Arlington, and well, that's about 20,000 cars a day. That's, an orders of magnitude lower traffic. And so we started to step back and say, okay, maybe that's really not viable. Maybe we need to let that be what it's going to be and mitigate for it. So we started looking at how we could make new development and redevelopment turn inwards and be more inner-focused, and then focus on those key connections across the corridor so that it didn't become a giant barrier. And that really interdepartmentally, again, they came in with sort of optimism and, hey, this is going to be great. And I looked at it and said, man, I admire your optimism, because there's some things that we need to do here. And I think we ended up, at least with the plan as it's in draft form right now, is a really good set of compromises. And I ended up with some short-term changes to our bicycle and pedestrian plan. We did already have some pedestrian improvements in the works. It was one of our most unsafe corridors, and we've been going through and doing median treatments and some work with leading pedestrian interval signals that have helped our numbers quite a bit. But it still doesn't look any better. People don't feel that, but we see it in the numbers.
And I know for that project, Paul, that there was a lot of emphasis on making sure that certain parts of that corridor were really reached, right? So folks who don't speak English as their native language, folks who are typically isolated when it comes to engagement. What were some of the things that you were involved in that captured their feedback and made sure that they were informed about the project?
The pandemic certainly made it a much different animal than it normally would have been. So rather than going out to some, musty old community hall and hoping people showed up, we had virtual meetings. We did a lot of YouTube engagement. One of our 3 virtual meetings was actually all done in Spanish. Luckily, John is relatively fluent, and I figured I could probably answer a question, but my Spanish vocabulary is really small, but I probably wouldn't. They'd have to ask me the question in English, and I could probably answer in Spanish. Luckily, I didn't get any questions. But it was a really neat experience, because I had never done that before. The entire web presentation from start to finish and all the questions were all done in Spanish.
Yeah, that's awesome. Next slide, please. So another thing that Raleigh is known for, and this is true for Capitol Boulevard as well as, most of the projects throughout the city, are pop-up events. They're relatively easy to plan. You get a lot of attention. You go to where people are, right? You reach people you normally wouldn't. And this is particularly true for the downtown north-south Greenway connector. And little fun fact here, this is actually the way that I learned about this project and learned what a cycle track was, is through a pop-up event hosted by the city of Raleigh. Paul was my tour guide on the bike ride there. Paul, can you talk about not just pop-ups, but this particular project and the importance of public engagement through those types of efforts?
Yeah, so the first batch of engagement was internal. We talked earlier about some of the interdepartmental collaboration, and Capitol Boulevard shows really planning and transportation working. This was truly collaborative. It's astounding how many uses there are on the curb face in a downtown grid. I mean, we had fire, we had solid waste, we had the postal service. I mean, everybody came to the table, and it became not just looking at trade-offs, but it was a giant game of whack-a-mole. If we do X, what's going to break? Is it okay if we break these 3 things to put this other thing in? But somewhere, something's got to give. Loading zones ended up being even more than parking, the sticking point. Parking, people can go to a deck. Loading zones, they really got to be where they got to be. We've even got a food hall that they bring in 2 trucks. One does the waste grease and one does the charging for the beverage systems that run with hoses. So they can't be more than a certain distance from the front door. We learned all sorts of stuff doing this. The pop-up was our first really big public outreach piece. There was one meeting before I got there. This was originally supposed to be on West Street, which is the farthest western part of our original 1792 grid. We found out that we ran out of right-of-way in one block. Back in the 80s, when everybody's downtowns were dying, we had a restaurant come to town that said, we want to build here, but to meet our parking minimums, we need 2 feet of your right-of-way to make it all fit. So the city gave them 2 feet of right-of-way. Well, it came back to bite us because we needed that 2 feet to make a 2-way cycle track work. Then we also had this transit referendum, and now there's going to be bus rapid transit on part of it to get to our new train station. So all of that sort of collaborated together and said, not West Street. So we moved 1 street to the east, Harrington Street, and we did a pop-up with our 2-way cycle track. It was a huge success in terms of public outreach. We had a tremendous amount of turnout. It happened to coincide with a big music festival, Dream Fest. I forget what it's called. Kristin will remember. Dreamville. And so not only did we have the normal sort of cycling community folks and passersby that would be going down to the train station, but we had all of the Dreamfest people walking back and forth between downtown and our signature park where the festival was being held. So we discovered some things outside of the public outreach component. We found out we have a lot of driveways, and that 2-way cycle tracks from a safety perspective maybe were not the best thing. In spite of saving some parking, drivers are not used to that. This is a Sunbelt city, and really grew after the rise of the automobile, and drivers just don't know to look for it. So we stepped back again, and we finally ended up with a 1-way pair with 1 direction on West Street and 1 direction on Harrington. We just finished the install last month of the first 8 blocks.
Great. Next slide, please. And I'm going to apologize for the train that you're about to hear. But I know that with a lot of these projects, when you and I talk and coordinate and have these conversations, you always mention Oaks and Spokes. We're always talking about the importance of this community group, right? Can you talk about that partnership that you have with them and how it's really helped inform your work?
Yeah, this really ends up being a 2-way street. Oaks and Spokes really pushes the city to get out of our comfort zone and do things that we haven't done before. That installation is our first in-street fully separated bicycle lane. So that was a big push for us. It took us 3.5 years to make it happen, and 2 coordinators, I might add. I came in partway through the process. On the other side of things, we get them to help us with a lot of our outreach. We have a really, really rigid branding and communications framework at the city. It takes time to run things up the chain, get permission. There'll be lots of changes along the way. It has to stick to really, really tight color and size of logo, all of those things. I can say something to Oaks and Spokes and they can have it on the street within 2 days. And the city can sort of give them what they need to inform whatever's going out. But the city can step back and just say, hey, we support this, rather than having it be city sponsored. And they do a lot of heavy lifting for us because it gets around some of those limitations that we have internally. So they're a great, great resource. They also managed to raise $20,000 for that cycle track and did a lot of the publicity. It paid for everything except the cones and the staff time for the pop-up. So planters, swag, free food that got offered, all of that was brought in by them.
Yeah, that's great. And it's interesting that they were at that cycle track. That's where you were my tour guide, all of that. It is the only event that I've been to so far where I've interacted directly with Oaks and Spokes folks, and I still get their updates, right? So that tells me that they're keeping a really great record of those touch points, who they've reached. And so I still know what's going on in the city from Oaks and Spokes a lot of the times because I'm still getting those updates. It's extraordinary. Next slide, please. Another big part of this cycle track and the larger project is that you were all over the news, right? Which is not always common for projects. Can you talk about your experience with the media?
I can. Again, I'm always a little scared when the television folks show up because you never know what 3 seconds of the 15 minutes they're going to pull out and take out of context if you're not careful. So that is one place where our communication staff does really earn their keep. So as much as I complained about them during the last slide, they're really helpful with the coaching and the managing of the television side of things. They set up all the appointments. They will guide you through. They'll take a look at your script if you have time to prepare one and help you look for those gotcha quotes that can get you into trouble. So they're really great. And then, frankly, the reporters that we have locally are pretty good. I've worked in some places where they're much more interested in the gotcha because it's a small market and they know they're not going to be there very long. But in a market like Raleigh, there's some longevity with the reporters, and that really matters for those of you who know what I'm talking about. It's that reporter knows they've got to come back to you in 6 months for another story, and so they're not likely to burn you. In one of the cases, one of the news anchors came out and she was in a mini skirt and still wanted to get on one of our bike share bikes to ride in the pop-up. And I used that footage to then shame a bunch of our city staff that didn't want to ride a bike. And I said, including the one who designs our bike lanes, I said, you've got to ride a bike. Here's this reporter doing it. I mean, you're wearing jeans. You can ride a bike. You're fine. Ended up being a really great teaching moment for the staff.
Yeah, that's great. And like it had people talking, right? So people who would normally just kind of walk by these cycle trying to be like, what are these like little white weird things in the road? It's like, oh, I saw that on the news, right? Because they may not be looped into the Oaks and Spokes and all of that, right? They may not get the city updates for one reason or another, but they saw it on, the news station. Oh, that makes sense now. Next slide, please.
And that also gets amplified by Oaks and Spokes who says, hey, did you see us on the news?
Right, exactly. And a lot of times, like I said, I mean, that's where a lot of those updates are coming from first. And then a couple of days later, oh, the city, sent this out. I heard this from here, or Oaks and Spokes sent an email before the city was able to do it. Prior to this, this conversation, we chatted with Cody, who's the current president of Oaks and Spokes, and he underscored as well the importance of that two-way partnership between their organization and the city of Raleigh. And it's a great reminder that, interdepartmental coordination is critical for the success of city projects. Also critical consistency in outreach and clarity in outreach. It's one thing to communicate, it's another thing to communicate effectively, right? And then also, and I brag on the city of Raleigh all the time for this, and Paul, you especially. The city is really, really committed to using whatever methods they need to use in order to reach folks. And so we're talking about, technology, right? And getting people involved that way, but also doing that door-to-door canvassing safely to make sure that word gets out.
Yeah, outside of Oaks and Spokes, we had we did one-on-one outreach with every single business owner on the corridor for the cycle track. And we were really having trouble getting to one of our historically African-American churches. It was founded before the Civil War ended, in fact. And we ended up having to actually go to our city council member from the district and saying, hey, Corey, we can't get anybody to return our calls from St. Paul's. Can you knock some doors open for us? And we had a meeting with the pastor and the church elders the following week. So sometimes you do have to pull out the big guns, but it was hugely successful. It turns out they needed a little space to set up their wedding and funeral motorcades. That we would never have thought of that.
Yeah, that's great. Paul, thank you so much for letting me interrogate you. I appreciate that. And with that, we turn it back over to Rich.
Yeah, thank you, Paul and Kristin. It was so great to hear about all those techniques you're using in Raleigh. And Paul, the term traffic sewer is one that I'll be adding to my repertoire. So thank you for that.